Hello and welcome to episode 19 of the Abbasid History Podcast, an audio platform to examine pre-modern Islamicate history and a global medieval past. And our first installment of a 12-part series entitled A Spring of Classical Arabic Poetry with Dr. Kevin Blankinship at Brigham Young University in Utah. Part 1, ʿImr al-Qays, 501 to 544 Common Era, an introduction to the mu'allaqat and pre-Islamic Jahili poetry. We are sponsored by IHRC Bookshop. Listeners get a 15% discount on all purchases. Visit IHRC Bookshop at shop.ihrc.org and use discount code AHP15 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. Contact IHRC Bookshop for details. I'm your host, Talha Hassan, a PhD student at School of Oriental African Studies in London. Now on to the show. According to legend, prior to the arrival of Islam, the Kaaba shrine in Mecca contained 7 odes written in gold on fine linen as testimony to their peak in Arabic poetic culture, literally hung or suspended, whence their name in Arabic, the mu'allaqat. These are formally recorded in the 8th century. Amongst the pre-Islamic Jahili poets whose works stood as an example of the preeminence in the Arabic oral literary tradition is ʿImr al-Qays, who died in 544 Common Era and whose youthful boisterousness, broken heart and revelry with peers still retains a freshness and directness in the age of digital media and the new oral culture podcasts. To discuss with me the life, work and legacy of ʿImr al-Qays is Dr. Kevin Blankinship. Welcome, Dr. Blankinship.
Great to be with you, Talha.
ʿImr al-Qays was born in 501 Common Era to a royal family in Central Arabia. Before we look at his life and works, tell us more about his socio-political and cultural context.
The tribal society of pre-Islamic Arabia flourished at the edges of what today we might call great powers. We had the Christian Byzantine Empire with its capital at Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, Turkey, of course, and the Persian Sasanian Empire with its capital at Ctesiphon, southeast of present-day Baghdad in Iraq. So subject to these two empires, there were Arab kingdoms who served as vassals, the Ghassanids of Syria, who were vassals to the Byzantines, and the Lakhmids, who were vassals of the Sasanians. And to the south, in what is modern-day Yemen, was the Arabian kingdom of the Himyarites. So aside from their own indigenous Arab Semitic culture with a mercantile center at Mecca and a ritual center at Mecca, pre-Islamic Arabs inherited a mix of influences, Byzantine, Persian, and South Arabian cultures, as well as the various religious traditions of Christianity, Judaism, and Zoroastrianism. So in addition to the Arab kingdoms of the Ghassanids and the Lakhmids, the pre-Islamic period witnessed continual formation and dissolution of tribal federations in which a chieftain or overlord ruled like a king. And one of these was Hujr, the father of ʿImr al-Qays, subject of our episode today, and perhaps most renowned in the lore of pre-Islamic Arabia, Kulayb Wa'il, the instigator of the infamous Basus War, which was waged between the tribes of Bakr and Taghlib for some 40 years. And came about supposedly by the slaughter of a camel belonging to a man who had taken refuge under the protection of a woman named al-Basus, hence the name of the war. So against this tumultuous backdrop at this time and place, elite fighters on horseback created a warring culture of manly virtue, muru'ah, marked by love of honor and driven by a lust for glory, plunder, revenge, and tribal loyalty. And what's interesting from this element of pre-Islamic Arabia is that even though internecine tribal warfare is an important backdrop to ʿImr al-Qays' mu'allaqa and the legends around his life, warfare doesn't figure as prominently into his mu'allaqa as it does in some of the other mu'allaqat and in other pre-Islamic poetry. It's true that he describes his horse and the things it can do in battle, but there are no battle scenes, no boasting in battle prowess, no vaunting of armor and weapons like we find in Antara or Amr ibn Kulthum or al-Harith ibn Haliza. And this makes ʿImr al-Qays something of an anomaly, even though his mu'allaqa is considered emblematic, which is important to remember, especially with pre-Islamic poetry, in which even today, sometimes a single poem is taken as representative when in fact it's every bit as personal as and idiosyncratic as the poet himself. I should also mention another key factor in pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, which is the natural life world of the poets who wrote it, especially the harsh desert environment, the animals and the plants they regularly encountered in everyday life, and the weather patterns and other natural phenomena that impacted where they resided and how they conducted their affairs. So we see this in long descriptions of animals and riding mounts, but also the environment itself, and in figurative language, like Antar's lovely line comparing the scent of his beloved Abla to a fresh, ungrazed meadow.
His father Hujr, the last Kindite king, disapproved of his son's dissolute ways of drinking and chasing girls, but he would redeem himself later in life. Tell us what we know about his life, including speculation he may have been a Christian rather than Arab pagan.
Like most of the classical pre-Islamic poets, Imr al-Qays's biography straddles legend and history, and it's preserved by sources like Ibn Qutayba's Ash-Shi'r wa Shu'ara, al-Marzubani's al-Muwashsha, and above all, the Book of Songs by Abul Faraj al-Isfahani. So according to the most common account, Imr al-Qays was the youngest son of Hujr, as you pointed out, the last great chieftain of the southern Arabian tribal group Kinda, and king over the apparently unruly tribes of the Banu Asad and the Banu Ghatafan. And the young Imr al-Qays showed early talent for poetry, especially erotic poetry, and may have been encouraged in this by his uncle, who was himself a famous poet, al-Muhalhil. So Imr al-Qays's devotion to verse led to his banishment from his father's house. His father, in fact, instructed, well, it's said that his father instructed his servant Rabi'a to put his son to death and to bring back his eyes as evidence that he had carried out the order. But Rabi'a took pity on Imr al-Qays and killed an antelope and brought back its eyes instead. Hujr later repented and Imr al-Qays returned to his father's house, but still refused to give up poetry, for which he was banished a second time. I guess old habits die hard. He took up after this the life of a wandering profligate, wandering the desert with companions and devoting his life to hunting, wine, gambling, and women. And supposedly this was his state when he heard about the regicide of his father, Hujr, supposedly killed at the hands of the rebellious Banu Asad. Imr al-Qays, the legend goes, was drinking and playing backgammon with a friend when the messenger arrived with the news of his father's genocide. "Your father has been murdered," said the messenger. Imr al-Qays ignored him and told his friend, "Keep playing." They continued the game until Imr al-Qays won, after which he said to his friend, "I didn't want to spoil your game." And then he turned to the messenger to ask for details, and when the messenger had finished, Imr al-Qays turned back to his friend, poured 2 glasses, and said a phrase that has become a widespread saying in Arabic even today, "Al-yawmu khamrun wa ghadan amr." Today we drink, business tomorrow. So with the help of other tribes, Imr al-Qays inflicted heavy casualties on the Banu Asad, but he still wasn't satisfied, so he spent the rest of his days seeking more vengeance for his murdered father. And his search led him to the Jewish prince of Taima, as-Samaw'al, to whom Imr al-Qays entrusted ancestral coats of armor. As for his death, there's another famous legend surrounding it. Supposedly, Imr al-Qays made his way to the court of the Byzantine emperor Justinian, possibly to strike a relationship of vassalage with the Byzantines. At first, Justinian lent Imr al-Qays an army with which to avenge his father's murder and regain his throne, but there were rumors that Imr al-Qays had seduced Justinian's daughter. And this prompted the emperor to send the poet a poisoned robe. And when Imr al-Qays donned this robe, his body broke out in sores. And the condition proved fatal. It's said that he lies buried today near Ankara, where he received this poisoned cloak as a gift. As for his being Christian, which you mentioned, Talha, this claim seems based mostly on a handful of references to Christian practices and symbols in his poems, as well as a few instances of the Arabic word Allah. And it could simply be that Imr al-Qays observed Christian practices at the time and were impressed by them without actually converting. In the selection I'll read today, there's a mention of the lamps of monks, which is an interesting reference in this vein. I should also mention a well-known khabar about a poetic contest in poetic description, wasf, of horses between Imr al-Qays and Alqama al-Fahl, another famous pre-Islamic poet. Alqama fought and won this verbal duel in describing horses with Imr al-Qays. And in fact, it was Imr al-Qays's wife, Jandab, who judged between the two poets. And as a result, Imr al-Qays divorced her, and then Alqama married her. Hence the nickname for Alqama, al-Fahal, the stallion. I share this anecdote because it illustrates this important connection in pre-Islamic Arabic poetic culture between verbal prowess and sexual prowess. And not just in this period. I think it's throughout classical Arabic poetry and indeed other poetic traditions. This is a very a well-known connection.
His mu'allaqa starts with his weeping at the departed's encampment of a beloved. What happens next, and what other works do we have attributed to him? But before that, tell us more about the mu'allaqa genre and the qasida poetic form.
By way of basic introduction, the traditional qasida poetic form is it's a poem with 1 meter throughout and 1 rhyme, which in the history of poetry is interesting because so much poetry that we might be used to in Western European languages alternates rhymes, and there might be stanzas. These things come later in the Arabic tradition, but at this point, there's just 1 rhyme and 1 meter. And it tends to be short, 15 to 80 verses, typically, which compared to epic verse or even later qasidas in Arabic, like the poem of the Sufi way by Ibn al-Farid, which is over 760 verses long. And at this point in history, literary history, the qasida was primarily an oral genre and usually written for recitation out loud in front of other people, especially in the pre and early Islamic era. It did become more of a bookish genre later on. For a traditional definition, one starting point is a statement made by Ibn Qutayba in his 9th century book of poetry and poets, Ash-Shi'r wa Shu'ara. And he describes the Arabic qasida as being comprised of 3 main parts. The first is the nasib, which is a nostalgic opening in which the poet reflects on what's past. And a common theme is the pursuit by the poet of the caravan of his beloved. But by the time he reaches their campsite, they've already moved on. After that, Ibn Qutayba gives a second section for rahil, or travel, which is as well as a release or kind of disengagement, takhallus, from the opening amatory prelude, the nasib. This is often achieved by the poet, describing a transition from the nostalgia to contemplating the harshness of the desert, life away from the tribe, and other things like that. And the third section, according to this definition, is the sort of the main thrust or message of the poem, which can take the form of tribal praise, fakhr, or of a ruler, praise of a ruler, madih, satire, hijat, or some kind of moral maxim, hikmah. So this is a fine description of one qasida in particular, namely the Mu'allaqa of Labid, which raises the question of whether Ibn Qutayba in fact is trying to describe the reality of all qasidas descriptively, or whether he's being prescriptive in a way that recalls, for example, Aristotle, who defines in the Poetics tragedy as being primarily a matter of plot, which betrays a preference for one particular dramatist, Sophocles, even though there were other tragedians focused on other elements. So in the Mu'allaqat, for example, one finds varied journey descriptions like that of Abid ibn al-Abras's Mu'allaqa, which has a journey description combining depictions of mounts with other tropes like meditation on past travels and hikmah. And this leads me to another point, which is that a lot of ink has been poured out over what constitutes a qasida, what are its component parts, whether those parts form an organic whole, and so on. And there's a generation of scholars who thought basically that the qasida had no overarching structure and denigrated it for that. Thereafter, there came others who tried to respond to that and give it its due, especially in aesthetic terms. So there's a famous statement by German Orientalist named Fritz Krenko, who said the Arabic qasida is a very conventional piece of verse with one rhyme, whatever its length, and a uniform meter. Consequently, the charm and originality of certain of the themes employed cannot prevent boredom and monotony from reigning over these never-ending poems. This is also a complaint traditionally lodged against, for example, the Persian epic, the Shahnameh, which seems repetitive to readers fed on a diet of modern novels. But one thing that we forget, I think, is that repetition serves an aesthetic purpose, which is to develop a theme over time and space by drawing parallels between certain kinds of action. We forget, those of us, again, used to certain genres, how much repetition we can bear in those genres that are familiar to us. So if we watch Western movies, to take a simplistic example, to depart too much from that genre would make it not be enjoyable as a Western anymore. The point is not to have one artwork be completely different from another within a genre, but to have variation on a theme. And another point here to remember is that to engage in the same kind of action as a revered ancestor for these sort of epic literary traditions meant to infuse one's own action with a kind of sacred power, invoking the past in order to bless the present. Another thing to consider here is that traditions report examples of poets being sort of paralyzed by the tyranny of the form, and that some have argued that this explains their hesitation regarding the original structure of a given poem, and that a poet would often recite a qasida on different occasions with variants and additions or suppressions. And this has been borne out through scholarship. Beatrice Grindler has a good chapter about this in the Festschrift for Wolfhart Heinrichs, called Classical Arabic Humanities in Their Own Terms, and her contribution is called Qasida, Its Reconstruction and Performance. A good analogy closer to our own time would be jazz, in which a given song evolves with each performance. Something else to point out is that there are internal differences. The formal structure of a qasida was not itself unitary across the Arabian Peninsula. Nathan Miller at Cambridge has written about the dhan scene in particular, in which the speaker in a poem observes his beloved's tribe's departing caravan, and reflects on the variable climatic regimes of different regions within Arabia. So one tribe, the Hudayl, would set the dhan scene, the departing caravan scene, at the beginning of the rainy season, while Tamim, in common with most other Najdi tribes, would set it at the onset of the dry season. So all this is to say that there were lived realities that would affect the form of the qasida, which make it hard to pin down sort of uniformity in this way. What is typical of the mu'allaqat is its economy, and it fashions complex, profound works of art out of a simple set of components, relatively simple. As for the collection of mu'allaqat, early Abbasid grammarians, lexicographers, and literateurs took interest in preserving their ancient Arabian literary heritage. Al-Asma'i seems to have already gathered 6 poems under the title of Kitab al-Qasa'id al-Sitt, and this is according to Ibn Nadim's Fihrist. Ibn Qutayba knew of a collection of 7 poems, and around the same time there appeared a collection of 9, which added the names of An-Nabigha and Al-Asha. And then another critic in the opening years of the 12th century CE, Tabrizi, gathered 10 mu'allaqats, adding the name of Abid ibn al-Abras. In all collections of the mu'allaqat, the names common to them are Imr al-Qays, Tarafa ibn al-Abd, Zuhair, Labid, and Amr ibn Kulthum. There were at least 3 collections of Imr al-Qays's diwan, his individual diwan, made by medieval Arab scholars, numbering as many as 68 poems. Some people doubt their authenticity, but nevertheless, we do have this sort of core of his poetry that exists. Should say one quick thing about the issue of authenticity, which is that the mu'allaqat have in the past been singled out as forgeries based on certain factors. Early in the 20th century, David Margoliouth and Tahir Hussein suggested that the pre-Islamic poetry that we have was a later forgery, based partly on the fact that nothing in the Quran or the earliest Arabic inscriptions resembles anything as complex, lengthy, or sophisticated as mu'allaqat poetry, partly on the questionable scruple of later translators, especially transmitters, especially Hamad al-Rawiya, and partly on the idea that Islam would, in its first decades, have swept away institutional memory of old poetry. Margoliouth, in particular, compares pre-Islamic bards to pastoral poets like Virgil or Theocritus, who we don't think of as actual shepherds or goat herds. It's clear that wasn't the case, but who write as if they were. The forgery theory has largely been abandoned, but there is still controversy, partly to do with the connection with the Quran, which differs in form and content from pre-Islamic poetry. Arguing against the idea that pre-Islamic poetry was written by later generations, Thomas Bauer has written that Quranic diction deliberately avoids any kind of resemblance to the form, style, or content of the poetry of its time, which in his view makes the Quran into a kind of antithesis to poetry. This is all to say that the question is still open-ended, but in general, scholars are not as skeptical as they once were about the authenticity of pre-Islamic poetry. Summarize very briefly ʿImr al-Qays's Mu'allaqa. It opens with a short description of the deserted campground and follows with the poet boasting of his former success among the ladies. And this amorous prelude, known as the Nasib, is longer in ʿImr al-Qays's Mu'allaqa than almost any other, which makes it noteworthy. And then there follows a Rahil segment, including a long description of the poet's horse. And finally, a description of a devastating thunderstorm. And all of this shape-shifting dominates the description. For his part, Imr al-Qays compares his horse to a rugged boulder. He describes the way its saddle slides around on the horse's back to pebbles sliding around in the rain. In the camel description section of the Mu'allaqa of Antara, we see something similar. His camel resembles an ostrich, that in turn resembles a funeral bier, a slave wearing a fur cloak. And when the poet's camel runs, she seems to be attacked by a cat tied to her side. Michael Sells has called this movement from one simile to the next in pre-Islamic poetry semantic overflow. It can seem monotonous and jarring to modern readers if we forget the issue of variation on a theme, which again, it doesn't mean that within a genre, one work of art has to be totally different from another, but that the artistry comes within playing on these well-established themes and motifs. And also the fact that the flora and fauna would presumably have been part of the poet's life world. They would have known these things and had them be part of their daily lives. It's important to keep in mind.
The Mu'allaqa of Imr al-Qays continues to feature in any syllabus of classical Arabic poetry. What has been its lasting cultural impact, and where should listeners look next to learn more about the Mu'allaqat and Imr al-Qays?
The pre-Islamic qasida has been traditionally regarded as one of two twin foundations of Arabic language and literature, together with the Quran, of course. And early scholars considered the poetry of the pre-Islamic era to be of a beauty and originality which poets in the Islamic period couldn't attain to. And here I should mention the debate among early Abbasids between the ancients, al-Qudama, referring to pre-Islamic poets, and the moderns, and muhdathun, meaning more recent and especially Abbasid poets. There developed a controversy between two rival poets of the 9th century CE, al-Buhtari and Abu Tammam. And since al-Buhtari remained closer to the ancient tradition, those who proclaimed his superiority supported the ancients, and those who considered themselves adherents of the moderns defended Abu Tammam. And this debate was stoked further by Shurubiyya and anti-Shurubiyya tensions in Abbasid society. These terms will be familiar to listeners, but to summarize, they denote a movement within early Islamic society which denied any privileged position of the Arabs and championed that of non-Arabs and especially Persians. So those supporting al-Buhtari and the ancients were in effect championing Arabic language and culture from outside influence. And perhaps in their minds, anti-Shurubiyya partisans could only be impressed by the so-called modern poets if those poets stuck to pre-Islamic poetic norms, which some of them, including Abu Tammam, were not ready to do. Famous collections of poetry of pre-Islamic poetry like the Mu'allaqat, the Mufaddaliyat, the Asma'iyat, and Abu Tammam's Hamasa became part of any good literary curriculum in the pre-modern Arabic-speaking world. They were to be admired, memorized, quoted, and studied, and taught in schools or by tutors. And they also served as an important reservoir for knowledge of correct classical language, including grammar, lexicon, and style. And pure, quote-unquote, pure Arabic and eloquence are prerequisites for inclusion in this canon, even when, after the Umayyad period, modern poetry couldn't be used as linguistic evidence for correct grammar. And through the centuries, the poetics of pre-Islamic qasaid, their meters, their length, their monorhyme, and sort of this 2 or 3 part structure of motifs and images dominates Arabic poetic production until several decades into the 20th century.
finally, let's hear a sample and translation from our subject today.
Today I want to read the final section of Imr al-Qays's Mu'allaqa, which describes a thunderstorm sweeping across the landscape and destroying everything in its path. I'll read the first 2 lines of this section in Arabic and then the English translation of Irish poet and translator Desmond O'Grady, who taught at the American University in Cairo and the University of Alexandria in Egypt, as well as in Rome in the 1960s and 70s. So the Arabic starts off like this. أصاحي ترى برقا أريك وميضه كلمع اليدين في حبي مكلل يضيء سناه أو مصابيح راهب أمال السليط بالذبال المفتل. And so in O'Grady's English, look, crowning that storm cloud, lightning. It flashes like a bowman's hand flicks arrows from his quiver. A brilliant blaze of light, like that of the lone hermit when he splashes oil on the twisted wick of his night lamp. We crouched and watched with an anxious eye for the weather as the storm ranged the wide waste of sky before downpour, then deluge. It battered the tallest trees to the ground like old men knocked on their beards. The splash and spray of it swept the hills and swept herds of white goats down the slopes. Not a single date tree stood standing, nor a house unless made of stone. The folds of rain looked like tribal elders in the long striped flow of their jubbas. The mountain peaks reminded me of the spindle's whirl when the flood tide torrented down its dross and dumped the lot on the plain, as a merchant dumps his bundle of merchandise in the marketplace. Come morning, it was as though the songbirds of the valley had drunk spiced old wine they winged and warbled so, and the wildlife, lost, drowned in the farthest reaches of the flood, looked like pulled-up bulbs of wild onion.
Thank you, Dr. Blankinship.
Thank you, Talha.